Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. This video explores the intersection of historical media and legal history, specifically regarding matrimonial law and divorce proceedings in the United States. The information provided is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Law is dynamic and varies significantly by jurisdiction. Therefore, the historical case studies and trends discussed should not be used as a substitute for professional legal counsel. We strongly advise all viewers to conduct their own due diligence and consult with a qualified attorney regarding any personal legal matters. In 1915, a woman walking into a silent movie theater wasn't just looking for an escape from her household chores. She was looking for a blueprint for her freedom. At a time when the word divorce was whispered in hushed, scandalous tones and legal representation for women was a labyrinth of systemic bias, the flickering silver screen became the most unlikely legal advisor in American history. We often think of early Hollywood as a factory of glitz and glamour, but for millions of American women trapped in abusive or stagnant marriages, it was a subversive manual on how to navigate the courtroom and reclaim their lives. Most people assume that the liberalization of divorce was a product of the 1960s sexual revolution, but the data tells a much more startling story. Between 1867 and 1929, the divorce rate in the United States plummeted upward by nearly 2,000%. This wasn't an accident. It was a calculated cultural shift driven by a medium that reached the illiterate and the elite alike. Today, we are pulling back the velvet curtain on how early U.S. cinema served as a silent partner in the dismantling of the traditional nuclear family, providing women with the psychological and practical tools to seek a legal exit long before they even had the right to vote. If you have ever felt that the media you consume has no real-world impact, this deep dive will completely change your perspective. By the end of this masterclass, you will understand how the narrative structures of the early 20th century created the modern American framework for female independence. We are going to examine the specific cinematic tropes that taught women how to document marital misconduct, the rise of the Reno divorce colonies as marketed by film stars, and the surprising ways that early filmmakers bypassed censorship to deliver legal education disguised as melodrama. This is the secret history of how the movies didn't just reflect society. They coached it through its first great domestic transition. To understand the magnitude of this shift, we must first look at the legal landscape of the early 1900s. In most states, divorce was governed by fault-based statutes. This meant that a woman could not simply leave because she was unhappy or unfulfilled. She had to prove a specific legal wrong: adultery, extreme cruelty, or desertion. The burden of proof was astronomical, and the social stigma was a life sentence of isolation. Enter the Nickelodeon. Unlike theater or literature, which required literacy and a certain level of wealth, the cinema was the great equalizer. It was cheap, it was visual, and it was ubiquitous. Film historians have identified a specific genre, known as the marriage problem film, which proliferated between 1910 and 1925. These were not just stories, they were case studies. Consider the 1915 film Inspiration or the various social dramas produced by Lois Weber, the most successful female director of the era. Weber's films such as Why Not? And The Blot took a clinical, almost journalistic approach to domestic strife. She utilized the medium to show women exactly what constituted legal cruelty. At a time when many women believed that physical battery was simply a husband's right, these films depicted such actions as actionable legal grounds for separation. They provided a visual vocabulary for suffering that allowed women to categorize their own experiences through a legal lens. The impact was measurable. When films began depicting the concept of mental cruelty, a revolutionary idea at the time, lawyers across the country reported an uptick in women citing emotional neglect and psychological abuse in their petitions. The cinema was effectively expanding the definition of human rights within the domestic sphere. It moved the conversation from what a husband was allowed to do to what a wife was entitled to feel. Beyond the psychological shift, cinema provided a practical roadmap for the logistics of divorce. In the early 20th century, if a woman lived in a state like New York, which had notoriously restrictive laws, her only real option was the migratory divorce. This involved moving to a state with more lenient residency requirements and broader grounds for filing. South Dakota and later Nevada became the primary destinations. However, the average woman in the Midwest or the South had no idea how to execute such a move. Hollywood stepped in as the ultimate travel agent. Movies began to glamorize the Reno divorce. They showed the high-end ranches where women would stay for the required 6-week residency period. They depicted the camaraderie of women from all walks of life, supporting one another through the process. By turning a legal ordeal into a cinematic adventure, the industry removed the terror of the unknown. Films like The Women, though later in the timeline, were the culmination of decades of cinematic groundwork that framed the divorce colony not as a place of shame, but as a rite of passage toward a better life. We must also look at the role of the movie star as a living case study. The personal lives of actresses like Mary Pickford and Gloria Swanson were followed with obsessive detail by the American public. When Mary Pickford sought a divorce from Owen Moore in 1920 to marry Douglas Fairbanks, it wasn't just a gossip item. It was a national lesson in the technicalities of Nevada's residency laws. The press coverage, fueled by the studios, functioned as a step-by-step guide. If the America's sweetheart could navigate the legal system and emerge with her reputation intact and a new, better life, the message to the average woman was clear. The law is a tool, and you are allowed to use it. This era also saw the birth of the gold digger trope, which, while often viewed negatively today, served a vital educational purpose regarding alimony and property settlements. Early films often depicted women who successfully sued for financial support, highlighting the importance of economic independence following a split. These narratives taught women that they didn't have to leave their marriages into a state of destitution. They showcased the potential outcomes of a well-argued legal case, emphasizing that a husband's financial obligation didn't necessarily end when the contract was dissolved. Furthermore, the cinematography of these early films played a role in the democratization of legal knowledge. Directors used close-ups of legal documents, telegrams, and courtroom evidence to drive the plot. This visual focus on the artifacts of the law demystified the process. A woman watching a film saw exactly what a summons looked like. She saw how a witness was questioned. She saw the physical space of the courtroom. In an age where women were largely excluded from public legal life, the cinema offered a virtual seat at the table. It was a form of civic education that bypassed the traditional barriers of gender and education. As we move deeper into this study, we will see how the 1920s transition into the talkies further accelerated this trend. The introduction of dialogue allowed for complex arguments about marital ethics to be spoken aloud, reaching the ears of women who may never have heard a feminist discourse in their entire lives. The cinema was the primary driver of what sociologists call the companionship marriage. The idea that a marriage should be based on mutual affection, rather than purely economic or reproductive necessity. When the reality of a woman's life didn't match the companionship she saw on screen, the film industry didn't just offer her a dream, it offered her a way out. This was the beginning of the great American divorce culture, and it was directed, produced, and edited by the pioneers of the silent era. To fully grasp the mechanics of how cinema functioned as a legal bridge, we have to look at the specific architecture of the films themselves. Imagine you are a woman named Clara living in 1922 in a small town in Ohio. Your life is governed by strict social codes and even stricter state laws. You have no internet, no access to legal clinics, and your local library carries only books vetted by the community's moral gatekeepers. However, once a week you spend 25 cents at the local theater. On that screen you see a world where women aren't just victims of circumstance, but active participants in their own liberation. This wasn't just entertainment for Clara. It was a simulation. During this period, the United States was a patchwork of conflicting divorce laws. This created what historians call a legal vacuum that the film industry was more than happy to fill. One of the most significant case studies from this era involves the 1920 film The Woman and the Puppet. This film, and others like it, utilized a narrative technique called the documentation montage. For the first time, filmmakers began showing the collection of evidence as a heroic act. In the film, characters are seen meticulously keeping logs of their husband's late-night absences or finding lipstick on collars. This was revolutionary because it taught the American public a fundamental legal truth. The court does not care about your feelings. It cares about your proof. By watching these sequences, women learned the necessity of building a case long before they ever stepped into a lawyer's office. Historical trends show that during the early 1920s, the quality of evidence presented in divorce petitions by female plaintiffs became significantly more detailed and standardized. They were essentially mimicking the investigative beats they saw in the movies. The films acted as a visual checklist for what would eventually be presented to a judge. This was the birth of the self-taught female litigant. Let's look at the data regarding the Reno phenomenon. By 1926, the city of Reno, Nevada, had become the divorce capital of the world. But why? Because cinema had branded it as such. In 1926 alone, Thousands of women traveled to Nevada to take advantage of the shortened residency requirements, which had been reduced from 6 months to just 3 months earlier that year. The film industry didn't just report this, they romanticized it. They created a subgenre called the Reno film. These movies followed a specific step-by-step process that demystified the migration. Step 1: the train ride west. Step 2: the check-in at a high-end ranch like the Flying M or the Washoe County guest houses. Step 3: the social bonding with other divorcees. Step 4: the final hearing. By breaking down the process into these digestible visual segments, cinema lowered the barrier of entry for women who were terrified of the logistical hurdles. It moved the idea of divorce from a clandestine, shameful act to a structured, social, and even fashionable journey. Case studies of real-world divorcees from 1926 show a high correlation between their expectations of the Reno process and the depictions found in films of the time. They expected a supportive community of women because that is what they saw on the silver screen. Another critical element was the portrayal of the divorce lawyer. In Victorian literature, lawyers were often depicted as vultures or dry, unfeeling bureaucrats. Early U.S. cinema flipped this script. Films like For Better, For Worse (1919) began to portray the attorney as a sympathetic ally, a professional who could navigate the chaotic waters of the legal system on behalf of the vulnerable. This shift in historical trends is vital. It normalized the act of seeking professional consultation. It taught women that having a legal representative was not a sign of aggression, but a necessary shield. The films often included scenes of the consultation itself. Viewers saw the quiet office, the leather-bound books, and the professional distance that allowed for a woman to speak her truth without judgment. This helped to alleviate the paralyzing fear of being shamed by a male authority figure. By seeing other women speak openly to their lawyers on screen, the American audience was being coached on how to articulate their own domestic grievances. Furthermore, we must examine the impact of censorship, or rather, the creative ways filmmakers bypassed it. Before the strict enforcement of the Motion Picture Production Code in the 1930s, the silent era enjoyed a period of relative freedom. Filmmakers like Cecil B. DeMille realized that they could show scandalous behavior as long as it was framed as a moral lesson. In movies like Don't Change Your Husband (1919), DeMille explores the boredom and neglect that can lead to divorce. While the film's ending might suggest a return to traditional values, the middle 80% of the movie provided a vivid, step-by-step exploration of how a woman could initiate a separation, manage her own finances, and navigate the social fallout. These films were essentially Trojan horses. They looked like moral tales on the outside, but inside they contained the blueprints for social rebellion. They addressed topics like financial settlements and alimony with surprising frankness. In a time when most women were not even allowed to hold their own bank accounts in many states, seeing a woman on screen receive a court-ordered monthly payment was a revelation of potential outcomes. It suggested a future where their survival was not entirely dependent on the whims of a former spouse. This cinematic influence extended into the very language of the courtroom. Historians have noted that the terminology used by female plaintiffs in the mid-1920s began to mirror the dialogue found in popular screenplays. Phrases like incompatibility of temperament began to appear more frequently in legal filings. This wasn't because of a sudden change in the law, but a change in the cultural lexicon. Cinema provided the words that women didn't know they were allowed to say. It gave them the vocabulary of autonomy. Imagine the risk these filmmakers were taking. Every time they depicted a successful divorce, they were being accused of undermining the foundations of American society. Yet, the demand was insatiable. The theaters were packed because the films were answering questions that the church, the state, and the family were refusing to address. How do I leave if he hits me? What happens to my children? Will I ever be able to marry again? The movies answered: you document, you travel, you hire a professional, and you rebuild. As we look toward the late 1920s, the stakes were about to get even higher. The transition to sound was coming, and with it, the ability for women to hear the arguments for their own freedom and high fidelity. But there was a growing storm on the horizon. The religious and conservative elements of the U.S. were organizing to shut down this cinematic legal clinic once and for all. They saw the rising divorce rates that were being fueled by the theaters, and they were preparing to strike back with a level of censorship that would change the industry forever. But before that happened, a specific type of film emerged that focused on a woman's right to a career post-divorce. This would become the ultimate challenge to the status quo. If a woman didn't need a man for money, the entire structure of the American legal and social system would have to be rewritten. How did the studios handle this radical shift? And what happened when the first talking pictures started giving actual legal definitions to audiences of millions? The answers lie in the shift from silent resistance to the loud, unapologetic era of the pre-code talkies, where the gloves finally came off. The transition from silent films to the talkies was more than just a technological upgrade. It was a legal amplification system. Suddenly, the silent gestures of a woman being mistreated were replaced by the sharp, biting rhetoric of female protagonists who could finally articulate the specific legal failures of their marriages. This shift fundamentally changed the way the American public processed information about domestic dissolution. By 1928 and 1929, the dialogue in films like Our Dancing Daughters or The Letter started to include sophisticated discussions about the laws of evidence. It was no longer enough to show a woman crying. The audience now heard her discussing the terms of her separate maintenance or her intent to file for an interlocutory decree. This development was particularly crucial for women like Sarah, a fictional but representative character in a 1920s textile town. Sarah might have seen the images of divorce before, but hearing the actual courtroom procedures spoken aloud in the dark of a theater gave her a script. In 1926, the average American woman had never heard a divorce proceeding in person, as courtrooms were often intimidating, male-dominated spaces. Cinema effectively broke the sound barrier between the legal elite and the common woman. These films began to detail the nuances of alimony pendant light, the temporary support a husband had to pay while the divorce was pending. Before the talkies, many women assumed they would starve during the months or years a legal battle might take. Hearing an actress demand this support on screen was a revelation of historical trends that suggested a path toward survival during the transition period. A vital case study during this pivot is the 1929 film Madam X. The plot involves a woman who is cast out of her home by an unforgiving husband and eventually ends up on trial. The film serves as a cautionary masterclass in the legal dangers of desertion and the loss of parental rights. It didn't just show the tragedy. It explained the mechanics of how a woman could lose her legal standing by making specific tactical errors. For a U.S. audience, this was deep dive education. The film showcased the importance of legal defense and the terrifying reality of the double standard in adultery laws. In many states at the time, a single instance of a wife's infidelity was enough for a husband to secure a divorce and custody of the children, whereas a husband's infidelity often had to be habitual or coupled with other grievances to be legally actionable. Cinema highlighted this disparity, fueling the public outcry that would eventually lead to more equitable legislative potential outcomes in the following decades. The step-by-step nature of these films also extended to the concept of the private investigator. As the 1920s roared toward their conclusion, the figure of the detective became a staple in the marriage problem genre. Films taught women the methodology of surveillance. They showed how to hire a firm, what kind of reports to expect, and how that information would be presented as a sworn affidavit. This was professional-grade knowledge. Women were learning that they could be the directors of their own legal investigations. They were shown that information was the ultimate currency in a fault-based divorce system. If you could prove the fault, you could secure the settlement. Let's look at the data regarding property rights. In the mid-1920s, most states still operated under laws that heavily favored the male head of household regarding the division of assets. However, a wave of films began to feature women who were savvy about their marriage settlements. They weren't just asking for a divorce. They were negotiating for the house, the car, and a portion of the business. These films were instrumental in shifting the public's character name for these women from homewreckers to stakeholders. They depicted marriage as a partnership with tangible assets that required an equitable split. This helped move the needle on community property concepts that were starting to gain traction in Western states like California. Imagine if you were a woman in 1926 who had contributed her own inheritance to her husband's business, only to find that the law considered that money his. Seeing a film where a protagonist successfully sues to recover her separate property was not just a plot point. It was a spark of legal imagination. These stories provided the mental framework for women to challenge their own lawyers to be more aggressive in their demands. It fostered a sense of entitlement to the wealth they helped create, a trend that is clearly reflected in the increasing complexity of property settlement records from that specific window of time. Furthermore, the influence of the film industry's own internal legal battles cannot be overstated. When a major studio star went through a high-profile divorce, the legal strategies used by their high-priced attorneys were analyzed and adapted for film scripts. This created a feedback loop where the most cutting-edge legal maneuvers of the elite were being broadcast to the masses for the price of a movie ticket. The cinema was effectively a leak in the dam of legal exclusivity. If a Hollywood lawyer found a loophole in the residency laws of a specific territory, that loophole would be on a movie screen within 6 months, often disguised as a plot twist. We also have to consider the role of the costume designer and the art director in this educational process. While it sounds superficial, the way a woman was dressed in the courtroom scenes of 1920s cinema was a lesson in forensic psychology. Films taught women how to perform the role of the innocent or the wronged party. They showed that appearing too wealthy could hurt your alimony chances, while appearing too disheveled could hurt your custody chances. This was the birth of the courtroom aesthetic, a calculated attempt to influence a judge's perception through visual storytelling. Case studies of actual court transcripts from the late 20s often include descriptions of the plaintiff's attire that bear a striking resemblance to the wardrobe choices of the era's leading ladies in similar cinematic scenarios. But as these films became more daring and their legal advice more explicit, a massive counterforce was gathering. The Hays Office, led by Will Hays, was being pressured by religious groups to crack down on any film that made divorce seem like a viable or attractive option. They were preparing to implement a set of rules that would forbid the mockery of the institution of marriage. This meant that the days of showing a woman successfully and happily navigating a divorce were numbered. The studios were about to face a choice: comply with the censors and stop providing this legal roadmap, or find a way to make their message even more subtle and subversive. How did filmmakers manage to keep teaching women about their rights when the censors literally banned the word divorce from some titles? The answer lies in a secret language of symbols and a new type of character that would dominate the 1930s. This was the era of the sophisticated divorcee, a woman who used wit and intelligence to bypass the laws that were meant to keep her trapped. But as the rules tightened, the legal education didn't stop. It just went deeper underground, leading to a period of cinema that was even more radical than the one that preceded it. The era of the pre-code talkie was about to reach its boiling point, and the legal implications for the American family would be permanent. The year 1930 marked a fever pitch in the battle between cinematic expression and legal censorship. As the United States plunged into the Great Depression, the economic desperation of the era began to collide with the domestic aspirations fostered by the previous decade of film. This was the dawn of the pre-code era, a 4-year window where the Hollywood studios, desperate to keep audiences in seats, pushed the boundaries of social realism to their absolute limit. For women watching these films, the legal education didn't just get louder. It got grittier and more focused on the cold, hard realities of economic survival during a divorce. Consider a case study of the 1932 film The Crash. While the plot centers on a financial collapse, the underlying narrative is a sophisticated tutorial on marital property and the legal repercussions of hidden assets. The film depicts a woman who must decide whether to stand by her husband or secure her own financial future as his empire crumbles. This wasn't just melodrama. It was a reflection of historical trends where women were increasingly forced to understand the fine print of their husband's business dealings. The film provided a step-by-step visual of how a spouse could be held liable for the other's debts, a concept known as the doctrine of necessaries. To a U.S. audience in 1932, this was a survival guide disguised as a blockbuster. During this period, the character of the gold digger was redefined. Rather than being a simple villain, she became a strategist. In films like Babyface, 1933, or Gold Diggers of 1933, the female protagonists are shown using the legal and social systems to extract wealth from powerful men. While the moralists of the day decried these films as indecent, for a woman like Evelyn, a fictional resident of a 1930s Chicago tenement, these movies were a masterclass in negotiation. They showed that a woman's beauty and domestic labor had a market value that could be litigated. These films detailed the importance of written agreements and the power of the breach of promise suit, a legal action that allowed women to sue for damages if a marriage proposal was withdrawn. By showcasing these potential outcomes, Hollywood was teaching women that their time and reputation were assets that the law could and should protect. Imagine if you were in Evelyn's shoes. You have spent 10 years building a home, only to find out your husband intends to leave you for a younger woman, taking the life savings with him. In the 1920s, you might have felt helpless. But after watching the pre-code films of 1932, you would know about the concept of alienation of affections. You would understand that you could potentially sue the third party for damages. You would have seen scenes where a wife's lawyer subpoenas bank records to prove that community funds were used to buy gifts for a mistress. This wasn't just a plot point. It was a tactical maneuver that was being used in real-world courtrooms across the United States. The data from this era suggests a fascination with the technicalities of the law. The 1930s saw a rise in the production of courtroom dramas where the dialogue was heavily vetted by legal consultants. Films like The Mouthpiece, 1932, focused on the charismatic, often ethically flexible lawyers who represented the marginalized. These characters spoke in a language of technicalities, teaching the audience about the burden of proof and the power of the cross-examination. They showed that the law was not a static wall, but a flexible instrument that could be played by those who understood its notes. One of the most radical developments of the pre-code era was the depiction of the working divorcee. Previously, a divorced woman was often portrayed as a tragic figure or a social pariah. But stars like Joan Crawford and Barbara Stanwyck began playing characters who not only survived their divorces, but thrived in the workforce afterward. This was a critical piece of the legal puzzle. A woman couldn't truly seek a divorce if she didn't believe she could survive the aftermath. These films provided a visual blueprint for the post-divorce career. They showed women as secretaries, department store buyers, and even journalists. By normalizing the image of the independent, divorced working woman, cinema was providing the psychological safety net necessary for women to take the legal leap. This era also saw the rise of the divorce comedy, such as The Gay Divorcee or The Awful Truth. While these films were lighter in tone, they were arguably more subversive. They often centered on the absurdity of the fault-based legal system. In many states, the law required proof of adultery, which led to a bizarre practice known as the staged adultery. A couple would hire a professional correspondent and a photographer to create fake evidence of a husband's infidelity, so the wife could be granted a divorce without the social stigma of being the guilty party. The movie showed this process in hilarious step-by-step detail. They exposed the legal system as a theater of the absurd, which had the unintended effect of destigmatizing the process. If everyone knew the evidence was faked and the judge was just playing a role, the moral weight of the divorce was lifted. It became a technicality to be navigated rather than a sin to be confessed. This historical trend of mocking the law's rigidity played a massive role in the eventual move toward no-fault divorce laws, though that transition would take decades to fully manifest. Furthermore, we have to look at the role of the fan magazine. Publications like Photoplay and Motion Picture Magazine acted as the footnotes to the films. They would run features on how to dress like a star in court or interviews with Hollywood's top divorce attorneys. These magazines often provided more direct advice than the films themselves, breaking down the costs of a Reno divorce or explaining the differences in alimony laws between New York and California. For the price of a nickel, a woman in a rural town could get a comparative analysis of state marriage laws that would have cost a fortune to obtain from a private law firm. But the window was closing. The Catholic Legion of Decency and other powerful lobbying groups were gaining ground. They argued that these films were a direct threat to the American family and were responsible for the skyrocketing divorce rates. In 1934, the Production Code Administration, led by Joseph Breen, began to strictly enforce the Hays Code. This meant that from July 1934 onward, no film could show divorce in a positive light. The guilty party had to be punished, and the sanctity of marriage had to be upheld at all costs. The legal roadmaps that had been so clearly displayed for 20 years were about to be scrubbed from the screen. However, the knowledge had already been disseminated. An entire generation of American women had been raised on a diet of cinematic legal education. They knew about residency requirements, they knew about alimony, and they knew how to collect evidence. The censors could stop the movies from talking, but they couldn't make the women forget what they had seen and heard. The battle for the American home was moving from the theater back to the legislature, and the women were walking into that fight with a decade of Hollywood training. But what happened when the lights went out on the pre-code era? How did women continue to find the help they needed when the screen was suddenly filled with images of happy housewives and domestic bliss? The answer involves a massive shift into the world of film noir, where the divorce narrative took a dark, dangerous turn. As the legal system became even more restrictive under the new censorship, the cinematic portrayal of marriage turned from a partnership into a trap, leading to a period of underground resistance that would eventually spark the modern feminist movement. The silent partner was about to become a very loud advocate once again. But this time, the stakes were life and death. As the doors slammed shut on the pre-code era in 1934, the American woman's legal roadmap didn't disappear. It simply changed its ink. The enforcement of the production code under Joseph Breen meant that the cinematic depiction of divorce now had to be framed through the lens of suffering or eventual reconciliation. However, this period birthed a new and perhaps more potent form of legal education. the rise of the film noir and the domestic thriller. If the 1920s taught women how to get a divorce, the late 1930s and 1940s taught them how to survive a predatory marriage. This was a dark, high-stakes classroom where the lessons shifted from courtroom procedures to the forensic analysis of coercion, gaslighting, and the preservation of civil rights within the home. Imagine a woman named Margaret living in a quiet suburb of Philadelphia in 1938. To her neighbors, she is a model of domesticity, but behind closed doors, she is facing a husband who controls every cent of their shared income and threatens her with institutionalization if she attempts to leave. In the pre-code era, Margaret might have looked for a Reno-bound train, but under the new censorship, the films she saw were more likely to reflect her own entrapment. Films like Gaslight or Rebecca provided a step-by-step breakdown of psychological manipulation. For Margaret, seeing these patterns played out on screen by stars like Ingrid Bergman was a profound moment of legal realization. It helped her identify that her husband's actions weren't just marital friction. They were a form of constructive desertion or mental cruelty that could, even under strict laws, serve as grounds for a legal separation. This era of cinema acted as a survival manual for the most extreme cases. Historical trends show that as the legal system tightened its grip on the definition of a valid divorce, films began to focus on the concept of the separate maintenance decree. This was a legal middle ground where a woman could live apart from her husband and receive financial support without a formal dissolution of the marriage. Cinema began to highlight the potential outcomes of these decrees, showing women that they didn't necessarily need a full divorce to find safety. They needed a legal shield. The role of the private investigator in cinema also underwent a transformation during this period. No longer just a tool for catching an unfaithful spouse, the cinematic detective became a symbol of a woman's need for an independent advocate. In films like The Big Sleep or Double Indemnity, the detective often uncovers the financial and legal rot beneath the surface of a marriage. For the U.S. audience, these movies were a masterclass in the importance of due diligence. They taught women to look at the fine print of insurance policies, the titles of their homes, and the beneficiaries of their husbands' estates. Let's look at the case study of the 1944 film Gaslight. The film was so influential that its title became a permanent part of the psychological and legal lexicon. In the story, a husband attempts to convince his wife she is going insane to gain control of her inherited fortune. For women in the 1940s, this wasn't just a thriller. It was a warning about the vulnerability of their property rights. It taught them that their mental health could be weaponized against them in a court of law. Step by step, the film showed how to identify the signs of this manipulation. The isolation from friends, the control of information, and the constant questioning of one's own reality. Exposing these tactics, Hollywood was providing a defensive strategy for women who were being marginalized within their own households. The data from the mid-1940s suggests a significant shift in the types of evidence being brought to divorce attorneys. There was a notable increase in the mention of psychological abuse and financial coercion, terms and concepts that were being explored with surgical precision in the film noir genre. This wasn't a coincidence. When a woman saw a character on screen struggle to prove that her husband was systematically draining her bank account, she learned the importance of keeping her own records, hiding her own money, and finding her own legal representation. Furthermore, the influence of the World War II era cannot be ignored. As millions of men went overseas, women entered the workforce in record numbers. This economic shift was mirrored in the cinema of the time. The independent woman was no longer just a cinematic trope. She was a national reality. However, the legal system was slow to catch up. Films began to depict the tension between a woman's newfound economic power and the restrictive laws that still governed her marriage. Movies like Mildred Pierce, 1945, served as a cautionary tale about the intersection of business success and domestic tragedy. It provided a deep dive into the complexities of child custody and the ways a mother's career could be used against her in a custody battle. A legal hurdle that remains a primary concern for women, even in 2026. Mildred Pierce offered a granular look at the potential outcomes of a woman trying to do it all. It showed how a successful business could become a liability in a divorce if the husband could prove that the wife's ambition led to a neglect of her maternal duties. For women watching in 1945, this was a vital lesson in legal strategy. It taught them that to win in court, they had to perform a specific version of femininity that balanced their professional strength with a traditional maternal image. This cinematic coaching was essential for navigating a legal system that was deeply invested in the status quo. Another critical point is the way cinema handled the return of the veterans. Many films of the late 40s dealt with the strain of post-war domesticity. They explored the legal and social implications of a husband returning as a stranger. These films often touched on the grounds of extreme cruelty, which was one of the few legal paths to divorce in more conservative states. By depicting the reality of post-war trauma and its impact on the home, cinema was providing a narrative that women could use to explain their own domestic situations to judges who were often unsympathetic to the plight of a wife wanting to leave a hero. The strategy of the filmmakers was to hide the legal education in the shadows of the noir aesthetic. While the censors were looking for overt mentions of divorce, the directors were focusing on the mechanics of the trap. They were showing the locked doors, the intercepted mail, and the forged signatures. They were teaching women that the law was a system of rules that could be used to cage them, but also a system that required specific forms of evidence to maintain that cage. If you could find the key, the proof of the forgery, the evidence of the hidden asset, or the witness to the cruelty, you could unlock the door. Imagine if you were a woman in 1947 who realized her husband had forged her name on a mortgage document. Because of the films you had seen, you would know that this was a criminal act that could void his claim to the property. You would know to go to a lawyer not as a supplicant, but as a victim of a documented crime. This shift from social shame to legal empowerment was the true legacy of this dark era of cinema. As we move toward the 1950s, the tension between the cinematic image of the perfect housewife and the legal reality of female independence reached a breaking point. The suburban dream was being sold to the public, but the movies were starting to show the cracks in the foundation. The next phase of this masterclass will explore how the transition to the widescreen Technicolor era of the 1950s led to a more overt challenge to the marriage laws of the United States. The era of whispers was over, and the era of the high-profile televised legal battle was about to begin. What happened when the most famous women in the world started using their platforms to demand not just a divorce, but a total rewrite of the American social contract? The answer involves a blonde bombshell, a revolutionary legal theorist, and a court case that would change the definition of a wife's labor forever. The transition into the 1950s presented a startling paradox for the American woman. On the surface, the United States was leaning into an era of aggressive domesticity, fueled by a post-war economic boom and the rise of the suburban ideal. However, beneath the pastel colors of the kitchen of the future, a legal and cinematic rebellion was brewing. This era saw the emergence of the blonde bombshell not just as a pinup, but as a high-stakes legal trailblazer. The most prominent case study of this phenomenon is, of course, Marilyn Monroe. While the public focused on her screen presence, her real-life legal battles regarding her marriages to Joe DiMaggio and Arthur Miller provided a granular education for the American public on the concept of mental cruelty and the right to a private life. In 1954, when Monroe filed for divorce from DiMaggio after only 9 months, citing mental cruelty, it was a seismic event. At the time, the term was often dismissed by the legal establishment as a flimsy excuse for women who were simply bored. But when the most famous woman in the world used it, she gave the term a weight that could not be ignored. This wasn't just celebrity gossip. It was a public masterclass in the grounds for divorce in California. Historical trends show that in the months following the Monroe-DiMaggio split, there was a measurable spike in mental cruelty filings across the country. Women were realizing that they didn't need to show physical bruises to prove their marriage was untenable. They were learning that the erosion of their spirit was a valid legal complaint. Imagine if you were a woman named Betty living in a newly built tract home in Levittown in 1955. Your husband is a respected veteran, you have 2 children, and on paper your life is perfect. But the isolation and the constant dismissal of your intellectual needs are starting to feel like a prison. In 1940, you might have felt you had no recourse because there was no physical violence. But after seeing the coverage of Monroe or watching films like All About Eve or The 7-Year Itch, you begin to see a different narrative. You see women who are fighting for their right to exist outside of their husband's shadow. These films began to subtly introduce the idea of psychological autonomy as a protected right. The 1950s also saw a shift in how cinema handled the economics of the household. As televisions began to compete with movie screens, Hollywood had to get more daring to keep its audience. This led to a series of films that explored the legal technicalities of the community property system. In states like California, the law dictated that any assets acquired during the marriage were owned equally by both spouses. However, many women had no idea how to track these assets or what they were entitled to. Cinema stepped in with movies that focused on the lifestyle of the wealthy, showing the itemization of furs, jewelry, and real estate. While these were meant to be spectacles of luxury, they functioned as an inventory checklist for the average woman. They taught the importance of knowing what you own. A critical step-by-step lesson from this era was the discovery of hidden assets. In the 1950s, it was common for men to handle all the financial accounts, often leaving wives in the dark about the true extent of the family's wealth. Films began to depict characters who were savvy enough to look through desk drawers for stock certificates or listen to business calls to identify secret bank accounts. This was a form of forensic accounting for the layperson. It empowered women like Betty to realize that if they were going to file for divorce, they needed to have their financial evidence in order before they made their move. The cinema was essentially teaching women to be their own private investigators in an age where they were legally treated as dependents. Then came the revolutionary legal theorists who were watching these films alongside the public. Lawyers began to cite the cultural shift toward individual happiness as a justification for easing divorce restrictions. They argued that the institution of marriage was actually weakened by forcing miserable people to stay together. This led to a historical trend where the courts began to be slightly more lenient with the definitions of fault. The cinematic portrayal of the sympathetic divorcee, someone who tried their best but simply could not survive the marriage, helped humanize the plaintiff in the eyes of the judge. We must also consider the role of the 1950s melodrama, specifically the films of Douglas Sirk. Movies like All That Heaven Allows or Imitation of Life went deep into the social and legal consequences of a woman choosing her own path. Sirk's films were masterclasses in the social cost-benefit analysis of divorce. They showed the potential outcomes of breaking the social contract, the loss of status, the judgment of the children, and the economic shift. But they also showed the profound peace that comes with authenticity. For a U.S. audience, these were not just movies. They were simulations of the life choices they were facing. They provided a space to weigh the legal risks against the emotional rewards. Step by step, these films also addressed the issue of alimony and child support in a way that was more realistic than ever before. Rather than just showing the dramatic courtroom win, they began to show the struggle of actually collecting those payments. They depicted the reality of the deadbeat dad long before the term was popularized. This was a vital piece of legal education. It taught women that a court order was only as good as its enforcement. It encouraged them to think about their own career prospects and to secure as much of a lump sum settlement as possible during the initial negotiations. By 1958, the cultural momentum was undeniable. The blonde bombshell era had evolved into a more sophisticated discussion about the value of a wife's labor. This was the moment when the concept of the housewife's contribution to the husband's earning capacity began to be debated in legal circles. If a wife stayed home to raise the children and manage the social life that allowed her husband to climb the corporate ladder, was she entitled to a share of his future earnings? Cinema explored this through films about the corporate world, showing the wife as the silent partner in the husband's success. It was a radical idea that would eventually lead to some of the most significant changes in matrimonial law in the 20th century. But just as the women of America were beginning to find their legal footing, a new challenge emerged. The 1960s were on the horizon, bringing with them a radical new wave of cinema and a total breakdown of the old censorship codes. The lessons of the past 50 years were about to be put to the ultimate test. As the birth control pill entered the scene and the feminist movement began to organize, the legal system faced a choice: adapt or break. How did the films of the early 60s prepare women for the arrival of no-fault divorce? And what happened when the cinematic roadmap finally led to a world where a woman didn't need a reason at all to walk away? The transition from the structured legal battles of the 50s to the total liberation of the 70s was a chaotic, high-stakes journey that would redefine what it meant to be an American family. The next part of our masterclass dives into the most controversial film of the decade, a movie so honest about the death of a marriage that it was blamed for a national spike in filings. The age of the cinematic divorce was about to go from a whisper to a scream. The year was 1966, and the movie that changed everything was Who is Afraid of Virginia Woolf? This film did not just depict a bad marriage. It performed an autopsy on one in front of a global audience. For the first time, the cinematic veil of polite domesticity was not just torn, it was incinerated. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, whose own off-screen marital dramas were already a matter of public record and legal fascination, brought a level of raw verbal combat to the screen that fundamentally shifted the American public's character name for what a marriage could endure. This film was a catalyst for a new era of legal consciousness. It moved the conversation away from polite legal grounds like desertion or adultery, and forced the United States to look at the concept of irreconcilable differences. Imagine you are a woman named Linda living in a suburban tract in 1966. You have been raised on a diet of films where marital problems were solved by a new hat or a heart-to-heart talk in the final 5 minutes. Then you sit in a dark theater and witness 2 hours of psychological warfare. You hear the language of resentment, the granular details of shared disappointments, and the total breakdown of communication. For Linda, this was a moment of terrifying clarity. It validated the internal monologue of millions of women who felt that their domestic unhappiness was a private failure. The film provided a public vocabulary for the death of intimacy. This shift in historical trends is crucial because it paved the way for the legal recognition of no-fault divorce. If a marriage could be this toxic without a single instance of physical violence or documented adultery, then the law had to change to accommodate the reality of emotional expiration. The data from the late 1960s shows a fascinating correlation between the release of these raw, realistic dramas and the legislative push for reform. In 1969, California Governor Ronald Reagan signed the Family Law Act, which created the first no-fault divorce system in the United States. This was a direct response to a decade of cinematic and cultural pressure that had exposed the old fault-based system as a charade. The movies had shown the staged adultery and the coach testimonies of the 1930s and 40s, and by the late 60s the public was no longer willing to play along. Cinema had exposed the theater of the courtroom, and the legal system was forced to modernize. A key case study in this transition is the 1967 film The Graduate. While often remembered for its soundtrack and its themes of youthful rebellion, the film is also a deep dive into the legal and social stagnation of the American middle-class marriage. The character of Mrs. Robinson is a step-by-step study in the consequences of a marriage of convenience. For the female audience in 1967, she was a warning. She represented the potential outcomes of staying in a marriage for the sake of social standing and property rights. The film highlighted the importance of early intervention and the danger of the sunk cost fallacy in domestic life. It suggested that walking away, even in a chaotic and unscripted way, was preferable to the slow death of the soul in a perfect suburban home. This era also saw the introduction of the legal aid lawyer in cinema. As the war on poverty and the civil rights movement gained momentum, films began to show that legal representation wasn't just for the Hollywood elite. We started to see characters who worked in community legal clinics, providing a roadmap for women who lacked the financial resources of a Mary Pickford or a Marilyn Monroe. These films taught women about the concept of pro bono work and the availability of state-funded legal resources. They demystified the process for the working class, showing that the law was a tool that could be accessed by anyone with the right information. Step by step, the films of the late 60s also began to address the specific hurdles of child custody in a more nuanced way. Before this period, custody was often an all-or-nothing game, usually favoring the mother unless her moral character could be assassinated. But as gender roles began to blur, cinema began to explore the concept of the father's rights and the best interests of the child. Movies like Kramer vs. Kramer, which would arrive a few years later but began its thematic development here, started to show the courtroom as a place of negotiation rather than just a battlefield for blame. This helped women understand that they needed to document not just their husband's failures as a spouse, but his engagement or lack thereof as a parent. Furthermore, the influence of the burgeoning second-wave feminist movement began to filter through the camera lens. The 1960s saw the rise of the independent cinema movement, where female directors and writers had more agency. They began to produce films that were essentially legal seminars on the rights of the individual within the collective of the family. They explored the concept of reproductive rights and how they intersected with marital law. For the U.S. audience, this was a radical expansion of the legal roadmap. It wasn't just about how to leave. It was about the right to control one's own body and future, while still within the marriage contract. Imagine the impact of a film that showed a woman successfully opening her own bank account without her husband's signature, a right that wasn't federally protected until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. Cinema was highlighting these systemic inequalities years before the legislation was passed. It was creating a sense of righteous indignation that drove women to the polls and to the law libraries. The movies were showing the potential outcomes of a society where women had full financial agency, and the contrast with the current legal reality was becoming unbearable. By the end of the 1960s, the cinematic roadmap had reached a point of no return. The old codes were dead, the new laws were being written, and the American woman was more legally literate than at any point in history. She knew how to collect evidence, she knew the residency requirements for migratory divorce, she understood the concept of mental cruelty, and she was beginning to see the possibility of financial independence. The cinema had been her silent partner for 50 years, coaching her through the shadows of the silent era and the grit of the noir period. But as the 1970s approached, a new and unexpected challenge emerged. With the arrival of no-fault divorce, the legal battle shifted from the grounds of the split to the division of the spoils. The battleground moved from the heart to the pocketbook. How did cinema adapt to this new, more clinical era of divorce? What happened when the drama moved from proving who was wrong to calculating who got the house? The next part of our masterclass examines the era of the high-stakes property settlement, where the cinematic divorcee became a financial warrior. We will look at the film that became a training manual for the modern alimony battle, and how a single scene in a courtroom changed the way every woman in America looked at her wedding ring. The era of the no-fault revolution was about to turn the legal system upside down, and the movies were ready to film every minute of the chaos. As the 1970s dawned, the cinematic roadmap for American women hit a massive intersection with the no-fault revolution. While the previous decades focused on the dramatic why of a divorce, the new era focused on the clinical how much. The legal landscape was shifting from the moral theater of the courtroom to the cold arithmetic of the negotiating table. In 1970, California had just pioneered the first true no-fault statute, and by the middle of the decade, dozens of states were following suit. Cinema, ever the adaptive instructor, shifted its focus from proving a husband's infidelity to a granular exploration of asset valuation and the long-term potential outcomes of alimony. Imagine you are a woman named Barbara living in 1974. For the first time in American history, you no longer need to prove your husband is a monster to get a decree of dissolution. You can simply state that the marriage is irretrievably broken. But this new freedom came with a terrifying legal vacuum. If there is no fault, how does a judge decide who gets the house? How do you calculate the value of 15 years of domestic labor? Cinema stepped into this vacuum with a series of high-stakes dramas that functioned as financial literacy seminars. A primary case study of this era is the 1978 film An Unmarried Woman. This film provided a step-by-step look at the aftermath of a sudden split. It didn't just show the emotional fallout, it showed the meetings with the accountants and the lawyers. It highlighted a critical historical trend: the shift from permanent alimony to rehabilitative alimony. In the 1950s, a woman might have expected to be supported by her ex-husband for life. By 1978, the films were teaching women that the court now expected them to become self-sufficient. This was a radical change in the legal roadmap. Barbara, watching this in 1978, learned that she needed to negotiate for tuition money or seed capital for a business, rather than just a monthly check that could be cut off if her ex-husband's circumstances changed. The films of the 70s began to detail the importance of the vocational expert. We started to see scenes where professionals would testify about a wife's earning capacity. This was deep-dive legal education. It taught women that their past career, even if it was 20 years ago, would be used as a metric for their future support. It encouraged a generation of women to document their lack of skills or their need for retraining before they entered the courtroom. The cinema was effectively coaching women on how to present their economic vulnerability as a legal asset. Another vital element was the depiction of the prenuptial agreement, which began to emerge in the cinematic lexicon during the late 70s. As more women entered the professional world and divorce became more common, the idea of protecting one's own assets before the wedding became a plot point. Films began to show the potential outcomes of not having such an agreement, often featuring characters who lost their family inheritance or their business interests in a messy split. For the US audience, this was a preventative lesson. It moved the conversation from how to leave a marriage to how to structure one, so that a potential exit wouldn't be a financial catastrophe. Step by step, the 1970s cinema also tackled the grueling reality of child support enforcement. While the laws were becoming more equitable on paper, the historical trend showed a massive gap in actual collection. Movies began to feature protagonists who had to navigate the bureaucracy of the district attorney's office to track down non-paying fathers. They showed the filing of wage garnishment orders and the use of the newly created Federal Parent Locator Service. This was professional-grade procedural knowledge. A woman in a small town could see the exact forms and the exact offices she needed to visit to ensure her children's financial security. Let's look at the data regarding the division of retirement accounts. In the mid-70s, many women didn't realize that a husband's pension was a marital asset. However, As the 1974 Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA, began to impact the legal system, films started to include mentions of these complex assets. Cinema taught women to ask about the 401k, the pension plan, and the stock options. It provided a visual inventory of what was truly on the table. This was a form of financial empowerment that bypassed the traditional gatekeepers of information. Furthermore, we must examine the role of the 1970s thriller in depicting the dark side of financial control. Films like Clute or even The Stepford Wives dealt with the themes of autonomy and the commodification of women. While these weren't traditional courtroom dramas, they served as a commentary on the power dynamics of the American household. They taught women to be wary of the joint account that they didn't have access to, and the legal documents they were asked to sign without reading. They highlighted the importance of having an independent identity and an independent credit score, which was a relatively new legal right for women at the time. Imagine if you were a woman in 1976 who had been told by her husband that she had no right to his business because she never worked there. Because of the films of the era, you would know about the concept of the marital partnership. You would know that your work in the home provided the stability that allowed the business to grow, and therefore, you were entitled to a share of its valuation. This was a revolutionary shift in the American public's character name for a wife. She was no longer a dependent, she was a shareholder. The 1970s also saw the rise of the divorce support group in cinema. Movies showed women gathering in basements and community centers to share legal tips and emotional support. This was a blueprint for the grassroots legal networks that would define the next decade. These films taught that you didn't have to face the system alone. They showed the power of collective knowledge and the importance of finding a lawyer who specialized in the new, complex world of family law. As the decade drew to a close, the cinematic roadmap had become a sophisticated guide to financial warfare. The transition from the emotional melodrama of the 60s to the clinical realism of the 70s was complete. Women were walking into the 1980s with a clear understanding of their rights, their assets, and the technicalities of the law. But a new decade was coming, and with it a conservative backlash that would attempt to roll back many of these gains. The 1980s would bring the era of the high-powered career woman and the return of the domestic ideal, creating a whole new set of legal and social conflicts. How did the films of the 80s handle the concept of the working mother in a custody battle? And what happened when the most famous legal case in the country, the Baby M case regarding surrogacy, started to influence the scripts of Hollywood? The next part of our masterclass examines the era of the superlawyer and the rise of the mediation movement. We will look at how cinema began to suggest that the best way to win a divorce was to never step foot in a courtroom at all. The age of the cinematic settlement was about to begin, and the stakes for the American family were higher than ever. The arrival of the 1980s brought a cold, professional sheen to the cinematic portrayal of marital dissolution. This was the era of the career-driven American woman and the high-powered litigation boutique. If the 1970s were about the liberation of the soul, the 1980s were about the preservation of the portfolio. The legal roadmap for women was no longer just about survival. It was about mastery. For the first time, Hollywood began to depict the divorce attorney as a celebrity figure, often modeled after real-world legal giants who were becoming household names. This shift in historical trends signaled to the U.S. audience that a divorce was not just a social ending, but a complex corporate restructuring of the family unit. Imagine a woman named Diane in 1987. She has spent the last decade building a career while also managing a household, a dynamic that was becoming the standard for the United States public's character name during the Reagan era. When her marriage begins to fail, she isn't looking for a shoulder to cry on. She is looking for a tactical advantage. In 1987, seeing a film like Fatal Attraction or The War of the Roses provided a dark, hyperbolic case study in the potential outcomes of a high-conflict split. While these films were stylized for entertainment, they contained granular lessons on the legal concept of the marital home and the psychological toll of protracted litigation. The War of the Roses, 1989, is perhaps the most significant educational tool of this decade. Albeit presented as a dark comedy, it offered a step-by-step deconstruction of the residency and occupancy rights within a shared property. It taught women that in many jurisdictions, leaving the house could be legally interpreted as abandonment, potentially damaging their claim to the asset. For Diane, watching the characters literally divide their house down the middle was a visceral lesson in the technicalities of possession. The film highlighted that the law often values the status quo, and those who remain in the home during the proceedings often have a stronger negotiating position. This era also introduced the U.S. audience to the concept of alternative dispute resolution, or ADR. As court dockets became clogged with the fallout of the no-fault revolution, cinema began to suggest that the most effective way to handle a split was through mediation. Films began to feature scenes where couples sat across a table from a neutral third party, rather than a judge. This was a vital piece of legal education. It taught women that they had a choice in how their case was handled. They could opt for a collaborative process that preserved assets and reduced the trauma for children, rather than a scorched earth trial. This historical trend toward mediation is one that has only intensified as we look at the legal landscape in 2026. Let us look at a case study of the 1980 film Ordinary People. While focused on grief, the film subtly explores the legal and social expectations of the mother as the emotional anchor of the home. It showed the potential outcomes of a woman who fails to meet those expectations during a domestic crisis. For women in the 1980s, this was a lesson in the importance of maintaining a record of maternal engagement. As fathers began to fight for joint custody with more frequency and success, cinema coached women on the need to be proactive. They learned that they could no longer take custody for granted based on gender alone. They had to prove their role through documented evidence of their daily involvement in their children's lives. The data from the late 80s shows a surge in the use of the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO. This legal instrument allowed for the division of retirement benefits without immediate tax penalties. Cinema, through its portrayal of sophisticated city life, began to normalize the idea that a woman was entitled to a portion of her husband's 401k or pension. Movies featured dialogue where characters discussed their future security in terms of these specific legal filings. This was a high-level deep dive into financial law. It taught the average woman to ask her lawyer about the long-term tax implications of their settlement, rather than just the immediate cash payout. Step by step, the 1980s cinema also began to tackle the issue of the double career divorce. When both spouses are high earners, the calculation of alimony becomes significantly more complex. Films like Working Girl or Baby Boom highlighted the independence of the modern woman, but also showed the vulnerability of her career during a domestic upheaval. These movies served as a warning to protect one's professional reputation and to ensure that a divorce did not result in a loss of career momentum. They depicted the strategic use of confidentiality agreements and the importance of keeping personal legal matters out of the corporate office. Imagine if you were a woman in 1988 who was a partner at a law firm or a director at a bank. Seeing a film where a woman's personal life was used as leverage against her in the boardroom was a lesson in forensic privacy. It taught women the importance of the non-disparagement clause. This legal detail, often buried in the fine print of a settlement, ensures that neither spouse can speak ill of the other in a way that would damage their professional standing. Cinema was teaching women how to protect their most valuable asset, their ability to earn. Furthermore, we must consider the role of the 1980s television movie. This was the golden age of the ripped from the headlines drama. These films often focused on specific legal precedents, such as the rights of a wife whose husband had a secret life, or the legal battle for a child's preference in a custody case. For the U.S. audience, these were weekly webinars on the evolving nature of family law. They provided a much more detailed look at the paperwork, the depositions, and the procedural hurdles than a 2-hour feature film ever could. They turned the American living room into a classroom for matrimonial law. By the end of the 1980s, the cinematic roadmap had evolved into a sophisticated manual for the modern independent woman. The transition from the silent era's focus on basic rights to the 80s focus on complex financial instruments was complete. The American woman was now entering the 1990s as a fully realized legal actor, capable of navigating the most intricate systems of the state and the market. But as the decade closed, a new technology was beginning to emerge that would change the nature of evidence forever. The digital age was on the horizon, and with it, a whole new world of surveillance and privacy concerns. How did the arrival of the internet and the early cell phone change the cinematic roadmap for divorce? And what happened when the films of the 90s started to show that a woman's own electronic footprint could be her greatest enemy in a court of law? The final part of our masterclass examines the era of the digital divorce and the rise of the forensic tech expert. We will look at how cinema prepared women for the world of 2026, where every text, every post, and every search can become a piece of evidence. The journey from the silent screen to the smartphone is almost complete, and the final lessons are the most important of all. The 1990s and the dawn of the new millennium brought the American woman to the final frontier of cinematic legal education. the era of digital discovery and forensic accountability. As we stand here in 2026 looking back at this transformation, it is clear that the transition from physical evidence to digital footprints was first mapped out in the multiplexes of the late 20th century. This was the period where the cinematic roadmap shifted from finding a paper trail to identifying a server trail. For the United States public, movies like Disclosure 1994 or Enemy of the State 1998 were not just thrillers. They were early warnings about the end of privacy and the birth of electronic evidence in domestic and professional litigation. Imagine a woman named Jennifer in 1999. She is navigating a divorce in a world that is just beginning to understand the permanence of an email. While she might have seen the silent stars of the 1920s hide a handwritten letter in a vanity drawer, the films of her era showed something much more terrifying: the deleted file that isn't actually gone. Cinema began to teach women the step-by-step reality of metadata. In legal dramas of the mid-90s, characters started to utilize forensic computer experts to recover wiped hard drives or track cell phone pings to prove a spouse's location. This historical trend signaled to Jennifer that the legal battleground had shifted into the ether. She learned that every digital interaction was a potential exhibit in a custody or property settlement case. A definitive case study in this digital transition is the 2010 film The Social Network, which, while focusing on the birth of a tech giant, offered a masterclass in the legal implications of status updates and private messaging. It showed how a person's own words, captured in a moment of frustration or ego, could be subpoenaed and used to define their character in a courtroom. For women in the early 21st century, this was an essential lesson in forensic restraint. Cinema was coaching them to treat every text message and every social media post as if it were being read aloud by an opposing attorney. Historical trends show that by the 2010s, digital evidence was cited in over 80% of divorce filings in the United States. The movies have prepared the public for this reality, turning the smartphone from a convenience into a potential witness for the prosecution. Let us look at the granular data regarding the impact of high-definition surveillance on marital law. As camera technology became smaller and more accessible, films began to explore the ethics and legal potential outcomes of domestic spying. Movies like What Lies Beneath 2000 or Gone Girl 2014 took the concept of marital documentation to its extreme, often dark conclusion. Gone Girl specifically served as a terrifying deep dive into the power of a curated narrative. It showed how a woman could use the tropes of the media and the legal system to construct a reality that the courts were forced to follow. While a work of fiction, it highlighted the very real-world importance of controlling the narrative in a high-stakes legal battle. It taught the U.S. audience that in the modern era, the person who tells the best story, backed by the most convincing digital artifacts, often secures the most favorable settlement. Step by step, the cinema of the last 20 years has also addressed the rise of the pre-divorce financial audit. In a globalized economy, hiding assets has become an art form, involving offshore accounts and complex shell companies. Films like The Wolf of Wall Street or The Big Short, while not strictly about divorce, provided the American woman with a visual vocabulary for financial fraud. They taught women how to identify the red flags of money laundering within their own household. They showed the importance of looking at the lifestyle-to-income ratio, a classic forensic accounting technique. If a husband's reported income did not match the luxury cars and international travel depicted on screen, women learned to suspect hidden wealth. This was professional-grade education that allowed women to direct their legal teams toward specific, often overlooked, financial targets. Furthermore, we must examine the 2026 perspective on the role of artificial intelligence in the dissolution process. As we have seen in recent years, the ability to generate deepfake evidence or use AI to analyze years of financial data has changed the stakes again. Cinema is already beginning to reflect this, with stories that involve the manipulation of digital identities. These films function as a warning to women about the vulnerability of their digital reputations. They teach the importance of digital hygiene and the need for high-level cybersecurity as a standard part of any divorce strategy. For a woman in 2026, a legal team often includes not just a lawyer and an accountant, but a tech specialist to protect her data and her identity. Imagine the impact of a 2026 film that depicts a woman using AI to predict the potential outcomes of her property settlement based on 30 years of local judicial data. This is no longer science fiction. It is the current trajectory of the legal industry. Cinema is once again the silent partner, showing women how to use these tools to level the playing field against more powerful opponents. It is teaching them that information is not just power, It is the only currency that matters in a court of law. The journey we have taken through this 10-part masterclass shows a consistent evolution. From the flickering screens of 1915 that taught a woman she could leave a cruel husband, to the high-fidelity thrillers of 2026 that teach her how to protect her digital sovereignty, the cinema has been the primary legal educator for the American public. It has bypassed the gatekeepers of the law, the church, and the state to deliver a roadmap for independence directly to the people. It has used the power of story to normalize what was once scandalous, and to empower what was once marginalized. As we conclude this deep dive, we look toward the future of the American family, and the medium that continues to define it. The roadmap is now in the hands of the individuals, fueled by over a century of cinematic training. The silence of the early era has been replaced by a global digital conversation, but the core lesson remains the same. The law is a tool, and you have the right to understand it, use it, and if necessary, change it. The credits may be rolling on this specific series, but the real-world application of these lessons is just beginning. In our next deep dive series, we will explore the untold history of how the rise of the true crime genre in the 1990s revolutionized the way American women approach personal safety and premarital background checks. We will look at how the shift from mystery novels to DNA-focused television created a new generation of amateur detectives who changed the face of the American justice system. The screen is never just a screen. It is a mirror, a window, and most importantly, a guide. The evolution of the American woman's rights has always been filmed, and the next chapter is already in production. Stay tuned as we pull back the curtain on the intersection of media, law, and the pursuit of justice in the United States.